Good afternoon, and thank you for coming, and thank you, Steffi, for letting me moderate the panel I was most curious about this year. That was very nice of you. Bear with me for a moment, because I would like to introduce our guests a little more thoroughly, and then I will not only recommend, I will urge you to search out their books, because I'm sure we can only scratch the surface in this panel, what these people have to offer. Steven Pinker here. He is a psychologist, a linguist, a cognitive scientist, and if that makes your head spin, he also wrote books about the genetic base of language, the makeup of human development, and most recently about the incredibly positive development that is the history of mankind. Steven Pinker always challenges the status quo of theories that are considered basic understanding. That makes him the perfect public intellectual. In The Blank Slate, for example, he dared to question the notion that all men are born equal, to turn it into a very brief version here. In The Better Angels of Our Nature, he deconstructed the common feeling that is so prevalent right now, that things are getting worse, and he proved things are getting better. He's currently with Harvard University, and when I first met you, you were at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And just to give you an idea of his stature in the academic life in the US, when I visited him, it was the start of the semester at MIT, and so a lot of first semesters came in, and you had a lecture at the beginning of a weekend when you would think students venture out to the bars and clubs, but no. A lot of people went to the largest auditorium there, and it seemed there were not only a lot of first semesters, there were a lot of first dates. It was like being at a theater performance or a rock concert, and they made jokes. The difference was they made jokes about mathematical equations, and I couldn't follow them all, but they were giggling a lot. So. You were basically what they had come for, and it was a lecture about the blank slate and the rhetorical brilliance that you used, challenging the basic of some of the humanities with a very scientific mind, made everybody's head spin. So now, if you live in Munich and you're lucky enough to have lunch with our other guest, Julian Nida Rümelin, that will make your head spin for quite a while as well. So we have an equal to Steven Pinker. He's a philosopher by trade, but you not only study philosophy, I heard, you also study political science, mathematics, and physics. So that makes you the perfect man with a toolkit for the debates of the 21st century. He's often mentioned as being part of the triumvirate of contemporary German philosophy, his peers being Jürgen Habermas and Peter Sloterdijk, which I think doesn't do justice to your work, because I think it's some statistical model that puts you in this round, and your work is very different. You've been one of the most outspoken critics of something that defines our future even more than anything Silicon Valley could dream up, that is education. Mm-hmm. And your criticism of the Bologna reform has been scathing and very refreshing, and you also wrote about the optimization economy, about democracy, and recently you researched and wrote about another very important subject for here, defining our future, robo-ethics, that was even funded by the European Union. So you even took the plunge as a practical philosopher into the abyss of politics. You were our Kulturreferent here in Munich, who was like the head of culture, and you were something like the cultural minister of Germany, which is a very, very, very long title and a very complicated description, but you were that, and you're still a member of the Commission of Values at the SPD? No, you're not?
No.
Then I was mistaken.
Politics.
Anyway, these are the two guests, and as I said, I urge you, seek out their books. They really make your head spin. My name is Kreye. I'm from the Süddeutsche Zeitung, from the Feuilleton, where we not only deal with the arts, but also about digital life. And we just produced an 8-page special for DLD, which might be lying around somewhere. Otherwise, you can get it digitally. I think in your gift bag is a code to get that. Let's start with our guest from America. So we take the Enlightenment for granted, but your new book is called Enlightenment Now. So where do we stand in the US, in the world, in Europe? Why do you claim enlightenment now?
We do take the Enlightenment for granted. It fades into the background as just the establishment, the status quo. But especially in recent years, the Enlightenment has been challenged. We have the rise of populism, of religion, of nationalism, of reactionary ideology, the desire to return to a golden age. And in Enlightenment now, I make the argument for the classic Enlightenment values of reason, science, humanism, and above all, progress. Steffi, in the introduction, spoke about a faith in progress, a naive faith in progress, and one often hears that expression. My attitude toward progress is that it should not be a matter of faith, of whether you're an optimist or whether you're a pessimist, but progress is an empirical hypothesis. That is, we can measure aspects of human well-being, how long people live, how healthy they are, how educated they are, how much leisure time they have, how safe they are. And remarkably, if you plot measures of human well-being over time, virtually all of them improve. So I argue that progress is a fact. It's not a matter of faith. I mean, it was quite possible that we would have seen a regression from a golden age. That is not what the historical record looks like. But progress is not a law of nature. It is not an inevitable dialectic. There's no law of the universe that says that people will achieve progress. It's rather a gift of the Enlightenment values of reason, science, and humanism. So I argue in Enlightenment now.
Let me quote your subtitle. It says, you make the case for reason, science, humanism, and progress. Those four things are basically part of the fabric of society and of history. Why do you have to make a case for them, to come back to that?
Well, in each case, they actually have been challenged. As opposed to the value on reason, many commentators say, well, humans are irrational. That was an Enlightenment fantasy, that people are rational actors. We live in a post-truth era, with the implication that we may as well give up on rationality and just fight demagoguery with demagoguery. So I argue against that, even though some of the arguments that humans are irrational come from my own field of cognitive psychology, from the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky and others, which I think has been misinterpreted to suggest that humans are incapable of rationality. So I make the case that reason doesn't come easy to us, but we are capable of it. Science has come under attack, both from the right, certainly in the United States, where conservative politicians regularly dismiss the results of science, but also from the academic left, from postmodernist ideologies, from the accusation that science is deterministic and scientistic and atomistic. So I defend the ideal of science as a force for human welfare. Humanism has to fight alternatives such as, if I define humanism as the ideal that the greatest good is the flourishing of humans and other sentient beings, there are alternatives such as that the greatest good is the glory of the nation or the race or the faith or dictates from divinity. And of course, progress is most in need of defense, because I've discovered that intellectuals hate progress. And
Why?
especially intellectuals who call themselves progressive. They really hate progress. It's dismissed as Whig history and naive, and the ideology of Silicon Valley and of the Chamber of Commerce. It's remarkable how few people believe in the ideal of progress, which is why the heart of the book is 75 graphs showing measures of human well-being over time, and the lines go up.
Well, let's talk to an intellectual, since we have one on stage here. You make the case for humanism and progress, and you just wrote a book that's going to come out in fall, so it's a little while, but let's talk about it anyway. You wrote a book about digital humanism, and humanism has been even around longer than the Enlightenment. So do we have to recalibrate our sense of humanism and humanity now in the digital age? And how do you view progress?
Well, humanism and Enlightenment are interrelated. Interrelated cultural attitudes, cultural developments, maybe also Even in the ancient times, one might say, well, classic Greek, ancient Greek times is a time of enlightenment also. It's about science, scientific rationality, another level, certainly, but science is an essential part of it. But humanism is more embracing, and to make this difference a little bit more clear. Humanism is about the human condition, what makes the human special, so to say, what is peculiar to the human condition of interacting, of thinking, of being author of one's own life, so authorship of one's own life. So I would not subsume, maybe we have a tiny difference here, humanism under some kind of utilitarian optimization model. Humanism is about agency, is about the capacity to live one's own life, even if maybe this capacity to live one's own life is not effective measured in terms of the sum of utility. So between utilitarianism, that is a threat to humanism, and humanism, there is a gap. And now to make it, if I may explain it a little bit more closer. Now, if you look to the human condition, I think there are three aspects that are probably the most central aspects. One is I take responsibility for what I do, meaning I can give reasons why I did it. I can not only explain it via psychology, for example, I can give reasons why I did it. And others may react and say, well, now I understand why you did it, but I oppose what you did. And now begins a certain form of interaction, discourse, one may call it discourse. And it's part of humanism to say, well, we don't use violence in such a situation. We use, again, reasons. So we have respect for each other. We look to others' interests, and so on and so forth. And the second part of the human condition seen from the humanistic perspective is that we take every individual human being, even an individual that might be formally not very much educated, as capable of developing and presenting reasons for what this person thinks, believes, and what this person does, and probably even for what the person feels. So also a good part of our emotions are led by reasons. This is a quite interesting point. I think we have no different point of views here. And the third point is probably the most important one, and this runs partly against a scientist worldview, and it is about freedom. So if we are responsible, we have to have choices. Yeah? If there are no choices, then we are not responsible for what we do. So I confess to be, in a philosophical sense, a libertarian. So without choices, no liberty. Without liberty, no personal responsibility, and then no authorship of how we live. And so what we have to think about is what fosters these human capacities, what gives more space for responsible behavior, responsible action, responsible feelings, responsible beliefs, what gives more space for being one's own, being author of one's life. So this is politically, ethically, culturally, economically, I think, a big thing. Yeah.
Feel free to jump in anytime.
Okay.
Both of you, but
I don't think there's anything that I overtly disagree with.
Yeah.
I mean, I think our conceptions of humanism are quite compatible. I certainly would not identify humanism with a kind of textbook utilitarianism in which you simply add up the amount of happiness over the human population and do whatever maximizes that arithmetic sum, for reasons that we're all familiar with. We don't want to, say, draft a hospital patient and sacrifice him and divide up his organs among a number of needy patients, which would maximize human happiness at the expense of killing an innocent person. But of course, nor would we want to obey some universal principle such as always telling the truth if the Gestapo came and demanded to know where Anne Frank was hiding, and we say, well, I guess I have to tell him because the principle of telling the truth is paramount. So I argue in the book that, and you're familiar with these arguments, that there is not a sharp dichotomy between the textbook utilitarianism of summing utility and strict deontological arguments. And when it comes to responsibility, I certainly do believe in the concept of responsibility. I guess I would be more of a compatibilist, maybe you are as well, in that I don't believe that when a person makes a decision, some miracle happens in the brain that defies the laws of physics. So I believe that there is a concept of freedom and responsibility that is compatible with the idea that the human mind consists of activity in the brain.
Maybe only to make clear that this is not a controversy, in fact. So maybe you are more compatibilist, I'm more libertarian, but there are no miracles. And I think to understand and explain the human brain and human decisions and human life such that there is no opposition to physical or psychological laws is essential. So this is not a point of debate.
Let me bring you back to the digital part of your book title, The Digital Humanism. So is this authorship, as you say, and also, I mean, you wrote about robo-ethics, so that's about a new form of responsibility that I think is not clear yet. But there was an interesting marathon on artificial intelligence at the Serpentine Gallery in London recently, and there was Hans Ulrich Obriste actually is here in the audience who started that, and there was a professor of informatics who came up with a very interesting explanation using Wittgenstein, which I'm not going to go into it because that's too thin-iced for me, but basically he said, we are facing a formidable creature we don't know yet. And I think in the past month, that formidable creature of artificial intelligence showed its face. For example, it can now produce its own artificial intelligence without the help of humans. It can win against the Go in the game of Go without the help of humans. So, does this challenge this, or is this just the perfection of tools?
Well, this is an interesting point. Now, if you are a behaviorist, probably this person is a behaviorist, Wittgensteinian behaviorist, then you look at social events, social processes, so to say, from the outside. And you just see how behavior is evolving, and then you try to describe these behaviors, and you give, at the end, some interpretation how to explain how this comes along. Now, if you are not a behaviorist, the difference is, then you say, well, this behavior is such, and this behavior is such. But what is essential is what intentionality is involved. So what does the person intend by choosing this action and that action? So what wishes, what desires, what beliefs are involved, and what, at the end, explains how the person reasoned, decides such and not such. And there one has to be very careful not to make a category mistake, or a new form of animism. Animism is the idea, well, there are souls all over. The tree has a soul, and the wind blowing is kind of showing a soul, and so on and so forth. And there's a new, I say it polemically, there's a new animism spreading, not only in the Silicon Valley. There's a new animism spreading worldwide, telling, well, now we have software systems, more or less autonomous software systems. And they are, why shouldn't we say they are animated? They have properties that allow us to say these are new kinds of agents. And if there are new kinds of agents, we have to change the law system in order to be able to decide whether this is right or wrong and maybe punish this robot. And I say, category mistake, be careful. Yeah? If we take this road, in the end, we have human rights for software systems. We can't kill software systems anymore. We can't use them for human means, for human goals, I mean, scopes. They are not merely means, they are something else. They are some other, some personality, animated. Yeah? Not only my 4-year-old child may misunderstand Siri and tell somebody is in, yeah? Nobody is in. Nobody is in. And this is the debate between behaviorists and some artificial intelligence proponents and digital humanism saying don't make category mistakes.
So in short, no.
No.
It doesn't challenge us. Okay, and what's your take on that? I mean, do you think...
Because I'm not sure that it's a category mistake. It would be now, since we don't have any artificial systems that are even close to duplicating the complexity of human motives and knowledge. But in a science fiction world in which you made out of silicon an intelligent agent that had reasons for its actions that it could articulate, because, again, it's not behaviorist in the sense that its behavior was controlled by the environment, but it had a knowledge base, it had a set of goals, it could pursue diverse means of attaining the goals, it registered its environment, including the state of its own body. Perhaps it would even object if it was harmed. As that started to approach human in its responses and complexity, I think our reactions might be to have a certain amount of empathy, and it would, in the limit, be an open question as to whether we would want to attribute consciousness and perhaps even rights to such a system. It's been played out in science fiction, in plots in Star Trek: The Next Generation, where Lieutenant Commander Data, a kind of android, is in danger of being dismantled for reverse engineering. And the audience's reaction is, well, he really does seem like he has some kind of rights. This would be an act of murder. It's not completely clear to me that if we ever approached that science fiction world, that it would be a category mistake. I think we'd be in deep uncertainty whether having to possess flesh is necessary for consciousness and therefore interests and then rights. There, my intuitions would break down. That is it just meat chauvinism, as they sometimes say in artificial intelligence, to say that you must have a squishy, soft brain, and if you had all of the complexity of decision-making, then rights would be stripped from you. My intuitions break down. I would not argue that they do have rights, but I'm not so sure that they wouldn't.
Well, there is no principled argument telling that you need flesh and bones and brain and so on in order to have animated entities. That's true. But you shouldn't mistake perfect simulation as realization. So even the perfect simulation of some kind of behavior does not tell that the entity that shows this behavior has the same mental properties like the person who has this.
Yes, so I'm not thinking of a kind of approximation of behavior that would fool an observer in, say, a Turing test, where all it would take is to fool someone for a certain amount of time. My science fiction scenario is that the actual states of knowledge of the system would be as complex as a human. That is, it would do things with some representation of states of affairs and complex branching algorithms that may be exactly what's happening in a human brain.
Well, I'm not convinced by the complex argument. You see, sometimes you are told, well, if one day artificial intelligence is better than human intelligence, it's obviously better. In many, many respects, it's much, much better for the moment. But this doesn't lead us to suppose that behind there is more, that there's somebody deciding, somebody knowing. Even there are good examples showing that even highly developed software systems do not understand what's going on, for example, because they are just unable, in some cases, to meet very simple challenges.
Oh, yeah.
And then,
but that's not the case. That's not the scenario I'm envisioning.
its usual interpretation is it simulates understanding, but there is no understanding at all.
Yeah, no, I'm referring not to simulation, but emulation,
Yeah.
where there would actually be a correspondence between the states of the brain of a human knower and the states of representation in an artificial intelligence system.
This is great. This is like intellectual Wimbledon for me.
Sorry.
Let me ask you a question. Let's start with you. Now, I think in the past month we actually reached a point of, I think artificial intelligence will always be what is called in German Inselbegabung, an insular ability. So they will be more brilliant in a very narrow field, and they will never grasp the whole field of human. But other entities also have special traits like this.
Sure.
So, but we just left the point where humans understand what's going on there. So we left the point where artificial intelligence is in our control, where we exactly know what it does. So it now does things that we don't understand. Is this just something, do we have to just play catch up to technology, or is there something new that maybe...
It's changing a lot. So traditional artificial intelligence is somehow top-down. Yeah? So you have certain algorithms and you know how they work, and then it's kind of complex. We have lots of data, and it works quite well, and you know what's going on, even if it's extremely complex. And this is changing because if you use bottom-ups, so-called self-learning systems, then you have certain valuation or valuing functions that tell, well, we want this result. We give you some tools, and now go on, whatever happens now. And now it learns quickly after 1 million of trials. It learns. And it learns and it learns as it learns. And in the end, we have a result what we wanted to have, not knowing anymore exactly how the processing goes on. And this is fine, but not in every respect. For example, I'm a little bit in the discussion about autonomous driving. And now think of the situation, we present the public some system that allows drivers not to drive anymore. Yeah? So even without a wheel, cars without a wheel. Some like this idea, some like it not, some like to drive themselves. But some like it very much. Now you present it. First type of software says, well, here we have the algorithms. Yeah?
Right.
It works like this, and there is an institution, TÜV, called TÜV in Germany, that proves whether this is okay or whether it's not okay. And now we have a second version. It works quite well, but we don't know how exactly. So now we come into legal and also technological troubles, and we are in the midst of these.
We're running out of time soon, but I wanted to, there's like as you see, a long list of questions we're not going to get to today, but let me briefly close. Does this development in the digitalized world, does this demand us to come up with a new form of humanism that you call digital humanism?
I think yes. Because there is let's say humanism somehow is embedded in our ethical, cultural, political life. For example, Article 1 to 19 of the German Constitution, right, or the General Declaration of Human Rights. This is a kind of political humanism or legal humanism. And it's well embedded. It's well embedded in everyday practices, everyday life practices, and so on and so forth. Now, with these new technologies, there is a certain threat to say, well, now everything is new. Now we have new agents, artificial agents. We have probably even a new law system that in the future judges about these agents, these new categories of agents. We ourselves can transform us into other beings, transhumanism, yeah, cyborgs. So it's all science fiction for the moment, but the idea is we leave all this behind. The human condition is overcome. We live in a new, brave new world, where humanism is not needed anymore. We need some values, we need some evaluation function somehow, but we find it out. And then there may one day this result in a decay of the normative constraints that we till now accepted. What we learned that it might happen very quickly in the 12 years of the Nazi regime in Europe. So a decay can come up very quickly. And my argumentation is digital humanism tries to reconcile the new digital technologies with the core of humanist attitudes, humanist ethics, humanist law, humanist politics.
Do you agree?
Oh,
Or do you agree first? And then also, I mean, the digital world was celebrated as an engine of enlightenment in the beginning. The internet was seen as kind of an electronic Weltgeist. Is this all challenged now? Are we approaching another turn?
Well, there are two aspects of the digital technology that I think come up in these discussions. One of them is, does the ability to communicate on a large scale through social media, through the web, promote enlightenment because ideas are exchanged, or does it just lead to communities of like-minded people reinforcing their own ideologies? And I think it's too early to say, because the phenomena of social media reinforcing ideological cliques has not been around long enough for us to develop countermeasures. So any new technology often will present unpleasant surprises, and it often takes a while to compensate to get the best aspect of the new technology without its disadvantages. I mean, that happened with radio and with television, and indeed even earlier with print. So I think it's too early to say. The other aspect of digital technology is artificial agents. Here I think it's important not to get too caught up with the current hype phase of the hype and bust cycle of artificial intelligence. There has been tremendous progress in Google Translate and self-driving cars, but it can very quickly plateau. And the more recent estimates that I've seen, even something as easy as a self-driving car, say that we may not have fully autonomous self-driving cars until 2070, according to an estimate in Science magazine. And driving a car is much easier than, say, changing a diaper or emptying a dishwasher. I think it's easy to think that, well, you have Google Translate, which is much better than systems that we had just 5 years ago, but as Julian noted, it doesn't really understand anything. You can't ask it any questions. It's very easy to be fooled by the rate of progress into thinking, well, we're on the singularity is going to happen in a few years, and we're going to have simulation, perfect replicas, or even superior intelligences made out of silicon. I think it's going to be much slower than that hype would suggest. Duplicating human intelligence is really, really hard. You can have sudden leaps, but I think the people working in artificial intelligence are often quite humble as to what the abilities are.
All right, we went into overtime. This could be the start of a great conversation. Maybe we all read your book and you come back, and we continue this hopefully at a much longer session next time here at DLD. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for having us.